Verses 42 to 45. The design of this story being to vindicate the apostles, especially Paul, as he doth himself at large, Rom 11, from the reflections of the Jews upon him for preaching the gospel to the Gentiles, it is here observed that he proceeded therein with all the caution imaginable, and upon due consideration, of which we have here an instance. There were some of the Jews that were so incensed against the preaching of the gospel, not to the Gentiles, but to themselves, that they would not bear to hear it, but went out of the synagogue while Paul was preaching, v. 42, in contempt of him and his doctrine, and to the disturbance of the congregation. It is probable they whispered among themselves, exciting one another to it, and did it by consent. Now this bespoke an open infidelity, as plain a profession of unbelief as coming to hear the gospel is of faith. They thus publicly avowed their contempt of Christ and of his doctrine and law, were not ashamed, neither could they blush, and they thus endeavored to beget prejudices in the minds of others against the gospel. They went out to draw others to follow their pernicious ways. An obstinate infidelity. They went out of the synagogue, not only to show that they did not believe the gospel, but because they were resolved they would not, and therefore got out of the hearing of those things that had a tendency to convince them. They stopped their ears like the deaf adder. Justly therefore was the gospel taken from them, when they first took themselves from it, and turned themselves out of the church before they were turned out of it. For it is certainly true that God never leaves any till they first leave him. The Gentiles were as willing to hear the gospel as those rude and ill-conditioned Jews were to get out of the hearing of it. They besought that these words, or words to this effect, might be preached to them the next Sabbath, in the week between, so some take it, on the 2nd and 5th days of the week, which in some synagogues were their lecture days. But it appears, v. 44, that it was the next Sabbath day that they came together. They begged that the same offer might be made to them that was made to the Jews. Paul in this sermon had brought the word of salvation to the Jews and proselytes, but had taken no notice of the Gentiles, and therefore they begged that forgiveness of sins through Christ might be preached to them, as it was to the Jews. The Jews' leavings, nay, loathings, were their longings. This justifies Paul in his preaching to them, that he was invited to it, as Peter was sent for to Cornelius. Who could refuse to break the bread of life to those who begged so hard for it, and to give that to the poor at the door which the children at the table threw under their feet? That the same instructions might be given to them. They had heard the doctrine of Christ, but did not understand it at the first hearing, nor could they remember all that they had heard, and therefore they begged it might be preached to them again. Note, it is good to have the word of Christ repeated to us. What we have heard we should desire to hear again, that it may take deep root in us, and the nail that is driven may be clenched and be as a nail in a sure place. To hear the same things should not be grievous, because it is safe. Philosophy 3:1. It aggravates the bad disposition of the Jews that the Gentiles desired to hear that often which they were not willing to hear once, and commends the good disposition of the Gentiles that they did not follow the bad example which the Jews set them. There were some, nay, there were many, both of Jews and proselytes, that were wrought upon by the preaching of the gospel. Those who aggravated the matter of the Jews' rejection by the preaching of the gospel, cried out, as is usual in such cases, they have cast away, and cast off, all the people of God. Nay, says Paul, it is not so, for abundance of the Jews have embraced Christ, and are taken in, himself for one, Rom 11:1, 5. So it was here, many of the Jews and religious proselytes followed Paul and Barnabas, and received further instructions and encouragement from them. They submitted to the grace of God, and were admitted to the benefit and comfort of it, which is implied in their being exhorted to continue in it. They followed Paul and Barnabas, they became their disciples, or rather the disciples of Christ, whose agents they were. Those that join themselves to Christ will join themselves to his ministers, and follow them. And Paul and Barnabas, though they were sent to the Gentiles, yet bade those of the Jews welcome that were willing to come under their instructions. Such hearty well-wishers were they to all the Jews and their friends, if they pleased. They were exhorted and encouraged to persevere herein, Paul and Barnabas, speaking to them with all the freedom and friendship imaginable, persuaded them to continue in the grace of God, to hold fast that which they had received, to continue in their belief of the gospel of grace, their dependence upon the Spirit of grace, and their attendance upon the means of grace. And the grace of God shall not be wanting to those who thus continue in it. There was a cheerful attendance upon the preaching of the gospel the next Sabbath day, v. 44. Almost the whole city, the generality of whom were Gentiles, came together to hear the word of God. It is probable that Paul and Barnabas were not idle in the weekdays, but took all opportunities in the week between, as some think the Gentiles desired, to bring them acquainted with Christ, and to raise their expectations from him. They did a great deal of service to the gospel in private discourse and conversation, as well as in their public sermons. Wisdom cried in the chief places of concourse, and the opening of the gates, as well as in the synagogues. Prov 1:20-21. This brought a vast concourse of people to the synagogue on the Sabbath day. Some came out of curiosity, the thing being new, others longing to see what the Jews would do upon the second tender of the gospel to them, and many who had heard something of the word of God came to hear more, and to hear it, not as the word of men but as the word of God, by which we must be ruled and judged. Now this justified Paul in preaching to the Gentiles, that he met with the most encouraging auditors among them. There the fields were white to the harvest, and therefore why should he not there put in his sickle? The Jews were enraged at this, and not only would not receive the gospel themselves, but were filled with indignation at those that crowded after it. v. 45. When the Jews saw the multitudes, and considered what an encouragement it was to Paul to go on in his work when he saw the people thus flying like doves to their windows, and what probability there was that among these multitudes some would be, without doubt, wrought upon, and probably the greater part, to embrace Christ, this filled them with envy. They grudged the interest the apostles had in the people, were vexed to see the synagogue so full when they were going to preach. This was the same spirit that worked in the Pharisees towards Christ. They were cut to the heart when they saw the whole world go after him. When the kingdom of heaven was opened, they not only would not go in themselves, but were angry with those that did. They opposed the doctrine the apostles preached, they spoke against those things that were spoken by Paul, cavilled at them, started objections against them, finding some fault or other with everything he said, contradicting and blaspheming, anti-legon anti-legant contradicting, they contradicted. They did it with the utmost spite and rage imaginable, they persisted in their contradiction, and nothing would silence them, they contradicted for contradiction's sake, and denied that which was most evident, and, when they could find no color of objection, they broke out into ill language against Christ and his gospel, blaspheming him in it. From the language of the carnal man that receives not the things of the Spirit of God, and therefore contradicts them, they proceed to the language of incarnate devils, and blaspheme them. Commonly those who begin with contradicting end with blaspheming.